Shock 2020.
Hello and welcome to this India Today special series, Eco Shock 2020, where we are looking at the state of the economy and we are triggering it off on a day when the Q1 GDP figures have come and they are the worst ever in 24 years since these figures were calculated. A negative growth of 23.9%. What does this mean for the economy going ahead? Joining us now is a very special guest. We're joined by the Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. K. Subramanian. Appreciate your joining us, sir. On a day when these numbers, 23.9% negative growth in Q1 are staring us in the face, how do you see it? Is this worse than what you anticipated? Because this was particularly at the peak of COVID.
Rajdeep, I think this is along expected lines because what we are going through is an exogenous shock globally. The pandemic has affected the economic fortunes across the world. For instance, if you take one statistic, since 1870, for the first time, the fraction of countries where the GDP per capita will decline is the highest. In other words, we are going through something that is a once in a 1.5 centuries event. So a clear exogenous shock. The April to June quarter, the entire globe was in a lockdown, with India being also in a total lockdown. Several restrictions on economic activity. So this is not unexpected. Just to give you a parallel, let's take the UK economy, which is of a similar size to India in terms of the GDP. The lockdown that was implemented in India was significantly more intense than that in the UK. The UK economy contracted by about 23%. And we've contracted by 24%. So this is not along unexpected lines. That said, what I do want to emphasize, Rajdeep, is let's look at a few statistics which are, I think, quite important. If you look at the core sector output, which had declined by about 38% in the month of April because of the lockdown, in the month of July, that has become minus 9.6%. And this has been progressively improving. Within the month of May, it was 22%. It was 13% in the month of June, and now 9.6%. If you look at a few other indicators, which are also quite important in the context of reading the economy, if you look at the railway freight traffic, that was at 95% level compared to what it was last year, same period in the month of July, and has increased by 6% in the month of August. If you look at the e-way bills, which basically captures interstate trade, in the month of August, it is at almost the same level. So this is indicative of a V-shaped recovery that is happening, and so the worst is definitely behind us.
Mr. CA, there are those who will be listening to you who will say you're still living in denial. When today you're suggesting a V-shaped recovery in the belief that July, August, September will be better, are you sort of, in a way, clutching at straws? The fact is, as the RBI report last week seemed to suggest, that the shock to consumption is severe, the poorest have been hit the hardest, and it will take quite some time to regain and indeed mend the pre-COVID momentum. Why not accept that maybe we are heading into a serious recession?
Rajdeep, what I'm saying is that there is a recovery that is on, and that is a V-shaped recovery. In other words, after the decline, the output levels have been actually becoming better. That said, there is no denying the fact that there is still residual uncertainty because of the pandemic. If we go back, 100 years, the Spanish flu pandemic was one that actually persisted for 2 years. So there is no denying the fact that there is a health, a pandemic that is going on, which creates uncertainty, and therefore people, resort to what we economists call the precautionary motive to save, which affects discretionary consumption. People are not going to restaurants, basically not going, to hotels on a vacation. Those do affect consumption. So all one is saying is that compared to the decline which happened because of the lockdown, there is a recovery which is actually, V-shaped. That is not denying still the fact that there is actually, there is still uncertainty. But I think the worst is behind us, and going forward, the numbers will be better.
Because various rating agencies have suggested that the economy could be contracting as much as minus 5% for the year 2021. Almost every rating agency is suggesting that we are in for serious negative growth rate. What do you peg 2021 to be? Is it possible today in end of August to predict what the situation could be like 6 months from now, given, as you said, the uncertainty? Are we heading, as I said, for even tougher times? You're saying the worst is over. There will be those who will say maybe the worst is yet to come.
Well, as I was pointing out using those statistics, Rajdeep, clearly if you look at, measures like the e-way bills, the power consumption and all the other high frequency indicators, those measures clearly indicate that we are at either at almost the same level or 90 to 95% of levels of what it was last year. And that is what leads me to say that compared to the 24% decline that happened in the first quarter, given that these indicators are almost 95 to 100%, the going forward measures will be better. But as I'm again emphasizing, uncertainty still remains because this is from an exogenous shock. Let's all keep in mind that this is not because of factors related to the economy. It's a pandemic that the entire global economy is going through, and India, as the fifth largest economy in a globalized world, cannot be immune to it either.
The fact though is that demand was shrinking even before COVID. It's now shrunk further. As you yourself admit, consumption demand is the real crisis. Even if, let's say, manufacturing slowly picks up, the fear is demand, consumption are not picking up. And in the absence of that, where do you see confidence? How do you see confidence returning to an economy?
So it's important to nuance this, Rajdeep, that when you look at demand, I would distinguish between demand for essentials and demand for discretionary items. It's the demand for discretionary items, and a lot of which are often provided by the service sector. Those are impacted because of the necessity of social distancing and the fact, by definition, it is discretionary. So people like you and me actually think that, we can indulge in consuming those once the uncertainty is over. So as a result, the consumption is impacted. I think it is very important for all of us to keep this in mind, that this is because of a completely exogenous shock, an act of God, as the Honorable Finance Minister had mentioned, which is what has brought down demand. That said, some of the measures that have been taken by the government have helped to reduce the impact. I think there's a fact that we all must keep in mind that consumption accounts for 60% of India's GDP. In contrast, the government spending is about 12%, so 1/5 of consumption. When you have a 27% decline in consumption, that will have its impact on GDP.
But when you say act of God now, when the finance minister says act of God last week, doesn't it send out negative signals that in a way the government is helpless? There's only so much we can do. We can't pay GST revenues because it's an act of God. Tomorrow, an industrialist will say that to a potential supplier, this is an act of God, I'm going to invoke force majeure. Does that send out purely in terms of sentiment the right signal when you say it's an act of God?
I think, Rajdeep, we have to be realistic. As I've mentioned, that this is an episode that is a once in a century kind of event. And in, an event like that, I think it is, it's sort of difficult to pretend as if there there isn't a health shock that is around us. It's not just in India, it's happening all over the globe. The World Economic Outlook has also mentioned that global economy is going to contract by 7%. It's not just India, every large economy is actually experiencing this as well. And, the sentiment is also affected by the health factor itself, the fact that there is uncertainty. All of us actually have some worry about falling sick. And that is something that cannot be done. That said, the government has taken the necessary measures. The Atmanirbhar Bharat package that amounted to 10% of GDP has helped, limit the damage. If you look at the data that has come today, it's actually government, expenditure that has really helped in reducing the impact, alleviating the impact, which is what, economic theory tells us as well. In times like these, because consumption goes down, investment goes down, and private sector is typically affected by risk aversion, government has to step in, and that is what indeed the government has done.
Let's look at solution. You're saying it's an extraordinary situation, and I think at one level one must accept that. You've got the likes of Dr. Manmohan Singh, former finance minister and prime minister, suggesting that the problem is that the government is not recognizing that this is a demand crisis, a consumption crisis. You need to put cash in people's hands. All the various packages that have been announced by the government have not done enough to put cash in people's hands to revive the consumption cycle. How do you respond to that? That the slogans of Atmanirbhar Bharat are all very well, but unless you put cash in hand, it's not going to revive the consumption cycle.
Rajdeep, I'm going to use a cricket parallel here. All of us have watched a bowler like Shane Warne bowling. It's not as if Shane Warne all the time bowled, outstanding deliveries. There were some long hops that he would bowl as well. I think it is important to keep that in mind. As I'm saying, that clearly consumption is impacted and especially discretionary consumption, because of the uncertainty. And, putting cash in the hands of people is not necessarily going to actually have an impact on demand for discretionary items. Demand for essential goods, yes, providing cash can have an impact. And in fact, world over, other countries have also given cash. We've used the PDS system to take care of essential items. Because when faced with uncertainty, all of us have this tendency to actually, save, to save for the rainy day. And that's what affects consumption. That said, what the government has done the package has provided credit and liquidity support to ensure that the impact on consumption and impact on investment are minimized to the largest extent possible.
The fear, of course, is that the informal sector in particular, the small and micro enterprises are the ones who've been most hit by the slowdown and now, of course, a possible recessionary spiral. And that the government isn't doing enough to cushion the MSMEs and the informal sector. This is a charge being made by critics. How do you respond to that? Do you believe that they remain the most vulnerable in these uncertain times and much more needs to be done for them?
I think, Rajdeep, if you look at the package of measures that have been announced, I think the MSMEs have been, by far the most important constituent that the government has kept in mind. Just take the 3 lakh crore emergency credit scheme that was announced, and the offtake of that has been very good. This was targeted primarily at the MSMEs. Together with that, the definition of MSMEs was changed to ensure that some of the artificial restrictions that prohibited them from growing actually are removed. This is something which is not just for now, but for future as well, to enable MSMEs to grow significantly and thereby contribute to the economy through jobs and through productivity increases as well. The third point that I want to actually mention is if you look at the sectoral composition of the numbers that have come today, take a look at agriculture, which has grown at 3.4% in this quarter, despite there being such an intense lockdown in the quarter. And that is actually very important because the measures that were announced as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, where the APMC reforms were undertaken, something that had inhibited the agriculture sector and had really chained them for almost 70 years now. that has, unleashed potential in the agriculture sector, combined with the changes in the Essential Commodities Act. This is also reflected in the fact that the rural inflation, for the first time, is actually, in the last 2-3 years, is higher than urban inflation, which is reflective of rural demand. So clearly, MSMEs, the agriculture sector, those that you mentioned as informal sector, have clearly been kept in mind.
What is hurting, though, of course, are services, especially hospitality, tourism. These have been particularly badly hit in recent times, but also a sense that the banking sector is still not in a position to provide easy lending, that the banking sector, which itself has been hobbled now for several years, unless that is restructured, there will be no, banks still are reluctant to give loans, especially to small companies. Do you get a sense that you will need to bring in far greater reform and restructure the way our financial sector operates?
I think that's an excellent point that you are mentioning, Rajdeep, on the banking sector. So here again, let me use a parallel from cricket. Recently, Mahendra Singh Dhoni had retired from cricket, and all of us cricket fans acknowledged the contribution that he made because he brought international recognition to the Indian cricket team. To just contrast this with the 1990s cricket team, which used to win very well at home, but wouldn't do very well, did not gain that international recognition. I think that parallel is something that the banking sector in India also needs to imbibe in terms of its mission statement, in terms of the way it thinks, that the Indian banking sector needs to actually be proportional to the economy, should be actually internationally, recognized. Just to give you a couple of statistics, if you take the top 100 banks in the world, and they are the ones that contribute credit to the economy, top 100 banks, India has only one bank in the global top 100, and that's a 55th ranked State Bank of India. If the banking sector was proportional to the size of its economy, playing like Dhoni's team would, then we would basically have 6 banks in the global top 100. And this is really paramount because any economy, be it the Japanese economy in the 80s or the Chinese economy today, they've basically grown because of the banking sector contributing. For instance, the Japanese economy, 18 of the top 25 banks were Japanese at that time. Today, about the same, actually 12 banks are Chinese global banks. So the banking sector is really critical. This is a time where the banking sector should look at the opportunity that this crisis provides and become proportional to the size of the economy and become internationally recognized.
Many of the reforms that you speak about, whether it's agriculture, whether it's banking, will eventually perhaps fructify in the long term. Now, many business persons one speak to say their concern is the short term, the immediate. Between lockdowns, re-lockdowns, unlockdowns, the various uncertainties, supply chains broken, they need to survive now. And their concern at the moment seems to be that it's all very well to use slogans like Atmanirbhar Bharat, but at the moment, it's a question of our survival. Do you believe that that is a temporary phase? Can we say with any confidence that 6 months from now, many more businesses will not collapse?
So I think it is important to keep in mind here, Rajdeep, I was mentioning earlier as well that the Spanish flu pandemic, for instance, which was a far more, intense pandemic than the COVID. Just to give you some figures, 15% of the global population was infected at that point in time. Today, even with the large numbers, less than 1% of the global population is infected. The rate of mortality was 10% in the Spanish flu pandemic. It's about less than 3% globally now. And that pandemic also actually, was brought under control within the space of 1.5 years. So it's really important to keep this in mind. When we are going through a pandemic, through a tough time like this, it is quite, common for people to think that this is what will continue. Something that behavioral economics call the saliency bias, that when we are in normal times, we continue thinking we'll be in normal times. And when we're in extraordinary times, we think that these will continue. But as evidence clearly shows, that we will get out of this. I think the global efforts on the vaccine are actually doing very well. Possibly by the end of the year or maybe beginning of next year, we will have a vaccine, in which case, life will be back to normal, which is what is really critical for the uncertainty to come down, and thereby economic activity to go back to normal levels.
Because the latest data released by CMIE, more than 1.8 crore salaried employees lost their jobs since April. 50 lakh salaried jobs were lost in India in July alone. These are figures that, in a sense get magnified. They are, they are creating a sense of feel bad. The feel good factor is gone. There's a feel bad factor. Is the government finally coming to terms with that? And recognizing that? Do you believe that there's a recognition in government at the highest level that these are tough times, these are turbulent times, rather than talking up the economy?
I think I have already articulated clearly that we are in a pandemic that is once in a century event. So there is absolute recognition that this is, these are difficult times that, the global economy is facing, and India, as the 5th largest economy in a globalized world, is not immune to that either. There is definite recognition about that. There is no denying it. But at the same time, what is also important is that the government has recognized that we have to actually take measured steps, because this is a pandemic that may actually continue for a year, maybe a year and a half. And so spending all ammunition just at the outset itself may not be advisable. In fact, if you see, we're 6 months into the pandemic and we still can't, even epidemiologists cannot tell us whether the pandemic will end. So it's really important to also keep some, ammunition in the, in the reserve. And therefore, the government has come up with periodic doses. The first episode came in, end of March, followed by the Atmanirbhar Bharat package. Reserve Bank today has actually announced a series of measures and has actually come up with periodic measures. So we clearly remain, open to the fact that we are, living through difficult times, and therefore we will do what it takes to actually respond in the right doses.
The worry, of course, is, as you said, you need to reserve certain ammunition already. We've crossed our budgetary deficit targets 4 months into the year. So, the concern is things are, the government is also going to struggle now to raise revenues, to raise resources. Do you believe that that is a real concern or not?
See, extraordinary times like these actually require extraordinary measures. And so, and in between this, if you think about the trade-off between growth and, fiscal deficit or debt sustainability, what I would actually say is that growth is what is really important, because it is growth that also provides actually debt sustainability. So, in times like these, what is really important is to make sure, that we basically do whatever it takes to respond to the economic needs of people. Government has already, if you look at the lockdown that it was, implemented, all of us recognize that, when faced with a pandemic, it is non-negotiable that lives have to be actually the most important. And therefore, there have been economic effects through which have been responded through these packages. The government remains committed to ensuring that the necessary measures are taken and growth is focused on not just about debt sustainability or fiscal deficit, during these extraordinary times.
So in conclusion, given that you used a couple of cricketing analogies, are we simply on a sticky wicket where we don't know where the next bouncer will come from or the next googly, that therefore these uncertain times is something we just have to live with for the next several months?
So I would actually liken it to a 50-over match where the first 10 overs, the ball has been swinging. And so, the openers are actually recommended to watch the ball and play carefully. But building that, making sure that they play carefully in the first 10 overs can then provide them the opportunity to score a big score by, maximizing it in the next 40 overs. That's the parallel that I would draw.
Let's leave it at that. You still sound optimistic even in these troubled times, and maybe that is one way to look at the future. Dr. K. Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor, thank you so much for joining us here on EcoShock 2020.
My pleasure, Rajdeep.
That's it on this India Today special with the Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. K. Subramanian. We will continue to track the economy. It is the big story of our times. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.